thank everybody for joining our Center for Critical Thinking webinar today as we welcome back our local expert, Brad Cornell. I am Amy Turner and I will be moderating the session today. Brad will be speaking to us about some of the environmental challenges facing Southwest Florida, namely Corkscrew Swamp and the issues that emanate out from the water challenges that we're seeing there. As you all may know, we've been having an incredible water quality issue for the past few years, and that's greatly affected our area, leading to adverse health and environmental challenges. Brad is the Southwestern Policy Associate for both the Audubon Western Everglades and Audubon Florida. He has a great depth of knowledge on many of the critical issues we're seeing today, and we were fortunate enough to have him join us last January, pre-COVID. So before we get started, I wanted to let you know that this will be the first in our Center for Critical Thinking series focusing on the challenges facing our local community. Please stay tuned for the upcoming announcements on this series, as well as some incredible topics coming in for the remainder of March and into April. I would like to mention that Brad will be taking questions at the end of this presentation, and viewers can use the Q&A feature to submit questions during his presentation. Also, this webinar will be recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel as well as to our website. In case your friends like to check out our previous webinars on those sites. So Brad, take it away from here.
Thanks very much, Amy, and thank you for inviting me to address the group. I appreciate everybody's interest. This topic of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary and its hydrologic issues, the water level issues, is something that's been in the news recently, and I think you'll find the way a number of us have approached this is pretty interesting as well as instructive. I'm going to share my screen now so we can have some video. Here we go. Let's see. Is that? Can everybody see this? Does that look visible? I'll assume that it is. I'm going to talk about Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary and some hydrologic problems that have been identified in the last 2 years, and a modeling project that we have pursued to identify the causes and the solutions, some of the solutions. But this is also going to be an opportunity to extend the reference to the whole region. So I think you'll see how this is not just a Corkscrew issue. Since we last spoke a year ago, I think I shared some water issues with the group when we were still meeting at the Fit and Fuel, which was a great evening. I look forward to some time when y'all go back there. But a lot of issues have been coming across the news wires. The Cornell lab had published a study documenting 2.9 billion birds since 1970 in US and Canada are gone. 29% of the populations of all those species, 300 some species. Worldwide, obviously, we're all wrestling with a coronavirus that has zoonotic origins, which means there's a wildlife link here. 2020 studies released in the journal Science showed huge declines in almost all, not quite all, insects worldwide. Climate change and climate destabilization is accelerating, unfortunately. But on the good side, the US has rejoined the Paris Accord. So there's that and a number of other administrative and political reasons for some optimism or some hope. The Army Corps of Engineers locally proposed last year and is continuing to work on a project that they call the Coastal Storm Resiliency study. And it's a multi-billion-dollar storm resilience project for Collier County. Audubon has been following that and is not real pleased with the approach that the Army Corps of Engineers have taken. But on the good side, just yesterday, the Lee County Commission voted to join a growing effort to organize regionally on climate change resilience and sea level rise adaptation called the Southwest Florida Regional Resiliency Compact. And this is very encouraging, and it's going to match the state's efforts in budgeting and policy making on this front. And as you all probably participated, or at least you read about, Conservation Collier received 74% of the Collier vote back in November, which I think last January, I was just talking about that campaign coming up. So that had a great outcome. So more to come on that. Let's turn to the Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary and their hydrologic modeling project that they just completed, led by Dr. Sean Clem, who's my colleague with Audubon, Florida, out at Corkscrew. So I'm going to share her portion of this, which is the technical portion. And then I have some thoughts on policy that you may find interesting. This is a regional map from space of Southwest Florida, and that yellow polygon in the middle is Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, 13,000 acre private Audubon sanctuary in the middle of the Corkscrew Regional Ecosystem Watershed. A huge 60, 70,000 acre wetland system that's vital for all of our interests. The emblem species, if I can put it that way, for this project and for Corkscrew Swamp specifically is the wood stork. And it's a threatened species that's very large, nests in the top of very tall cypress trees. So it's easy to count, easy to see. And we haven't been seeing as many of them recently in recent years. And that's been a cause for concern. Historically, the Corkscrew colony at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary was the largest in the nation by far. Thousands of pairs of wood storks nested there annually, almost every single year. Audubon is protecting that colony and that forest for over 100 years since hiring wardens back in the early 1900s. But in recent years, in the last several decades, the colony has been declining. You can see from these data going back to the late 1950s that the numbers have precipitously declined, primarily because of loss of wetlands, loss of habitat. But in more recent years, the declines have shifted from just less nesting to not nesting at all in most years. And you can see that in the data on this graph. That's been the reason for us to look at this. This is a map of the wetland losses for shallow wetlands in Southwest Florida. The pink are shallow wetlands, which are particularly critical for nest initiation and nesting of wood storks. And in the left is what the models show the wetland systems were pre-development, before anybody was here in Southwest Florida. You can see them covering most of the region. And then in the right is a data set from the Water Management District showing we've lost over 70% of those shallow wetlands. This is one of the primary reasons for the decline of wood storks. That means that they get less food, they have less places to forage, and the timing of all that foraging means less babies. You can see that fuzzy wood stork head only a mother could love. But nevertheless, they are important, and they eat a lot of fish. 400 pounds of fish per nest is a big demand. Those parents are busy when they are nesting, and that's why there's been so much problem. We're fortunate at Corkscrew to have a large data set that goes back to the late 1950s, over 60 years of water data, hydrologic data. We have staff gauges on. This is the outline of the boardwalk at Corkscrew, a 2¼ mile boardwalk. If anybody's been out there, if you haven't, it's open, you can go, just need to make reservations. But they have groundwater well data, as well as rain gauges, and a staff gauge that goes back over 60 years, which is one of the longest hydrologic data sets in the region. What it's telling us is for 40 years, from 1960 to 2000, the swamps, the deepest parts of the swamp, the ponds, the cypress sloughs, the cypress heads, would fill up with water in the summer and stay wet almost all year round, never dry down, never go below ground. And then from the 2000s to the present, we have seen those deep wetlands dry down below ground 4 out of every 5 years since then, in the last 20 years, which is the reason for our concern. These are the hydrographs by decade average of those declines. So you can see in the 1960s, this bottom line is ground level, and these are the feet above ground level, and this is the hydrologic year starting in June 1st, going to May 31st at the other end. And you can see, on average, water levels are low in the wintertime, about 1/2 foot, and then as it rains in June, they climb to over 3 feet, and then slowly subside as the rains stop in October, and never go below ground except once every 5 years. So on average, they're pretty healthy. That's the 60s. This is the 70s, pretty much the same hydrograph. Here's the 1980s, never goes below ground on average. Here's the 1990s, same curve. And all of a sudden, here are the 2000s, and you see something drastically different. Water is going below ground at the end of the dry season, at the end of April, beginning of May, and doesn't come back up until the end of June for almost 2 months. This is something we had never seen before on average. And even though the swamp is filling to the same level it always did. So this was something alarming that our scientists identified when they analyzed those 60 years of data. Here's the 2010s, same issue. It's going below ground before May and not coming back until after June, even though we're getting that same amount of rain and same wet season fill up of the swamp. So that's the problem that we faced. And it's not something that was of our doing. There's nothing we have changed at Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary itself. So here's an overlay of the 1960s in green and the 2010s in brown or orange. And you can see the much more precipitous decline in the dry season. So something is clearly pulling the water out of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary rapidly after the rains stop. And you can see the slope of that curve. So that's the challenge that we had. The consequences of it are that we have 2 months or more less of water in our deep marshes, in the bald cypress, and in our ponds, like the Lettuce Lake as you go around the boardwalk. And that has implications for wildlife. We cannot have, there's less fish to eat, which means there's less food for feeding the wood stork babies as well as other wildlife, and has a direct impact on wood stork success. I will also note that when the swamp, this is something I never knew until our scientists pointed this out, and as one of the reasons that we're losing our wood stork nesting. There's a symbiotic relationship between alligators and wood storks that you wouldn't know except for when you take away the water, suddenly you've taken away the alligators. What happens is with water underneath those cypress trees where the wood storks nest, the alligators show up there because chicks fall out of the nest occasionally and they get to eat those chicks. But in that attraction of alligators, the wood storks gain pretty aggressive sentries or guards for their nests, which means raccoons will be afraid to go climbing up those trees because you've got alligators at the bottom of them. So they effectively keep mammalian predators away from the nests. You take away the water, the alligators go away. And we had in 2018, the first time we had seen raccoons went up and destroyed, ate every egg, ate every chick in the nesting colony that year. And it made us realize we have a big problem because of hydrology. It also has consequences for plants because the water underneath these trees creates a microclimate that's humid, keeps the temperature moderated, so the occasional cold snap or freeze that we get will not kill orchids like this super ghost, which is 50 feet up in this particular cypress tree that Max Stone, a biologist friend of Corkscrew's, who used to work for Audubon, he took this picture, and to see how he did that was quite a scene. But anyway, the ghost orchid is protected by the microclimate of the water, and we fear for the loss of that water and the loss of these plants, epiphytes and other plants that depend on that. It also makes it harder to burn because we're too dry, and that increases the likelihood of catastrophic wildfire, fire that would kill all the trees rather than just burn the grasses at the bottom of and the litter at the bottom of the forest floor. A catastrophic wildfire is too big, too hot, and too damaging and not natural. And when you overdry the landscape, that's the consequence you have, which is not only a threat for Corkscrew Swamp and its ecosystem, it's also a threat to humans. And this is a map of a wildfire that was 8,250 acres last May. This is the landfill down there by exit 101 on I-75. Here's Everglades Boulevard. This was a large fire that got out of control. It was catastrophic. It went into North Golden Gate Estates and North Belmead, and 750 families had to evacuate. That kind of fire is very scary when you have cabbage palms and lots of litter on the ground in Golden Gate Estates and these semi-rural neighborhoods, even the Corkscrew Island neighborhood. So, we read all about fires, catastrophic wildfires in California and Washington and Oregon, but that same thing could happen in our dry season neighborhoods where it's rural. And one way to push back on that is to return water to those landscapes. Also, it's a consequence on water supply. Wetlands that hold water also recharge the aquifer and clean that water. And there's a direct connection that people often forget between the wetlands, like the Crew system and Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, and the coast. So this year we have been struggling with red tide. In fact, there's still moderate red tide in the Pine Island Sound and around Sanibel and Captiva this week. And that's a big problem. It's fed by nutrients that fuel algae blooms and red tides. And the link with the Corkscrew wetlands is that the longer the waters that come in the rains with the rainy season, the longer those waters move through wetlands, the more of those nutrients are uptaken by plants, trees, and grasses. And then finally, that cleaner water that slowly moves in sheet flow to the coast will be much, much cleaner. Unfortunately, what we have created is a system of canals that and destroyed, as I showed in that other map, most of the wetlands. And so we don't have our filtration system. We don't have our ways to take out nitrogen and phosphorus from those waters. So consequently, we have been suffering more frequent and more severe red tide and blue-green algae blooms in areas downstream at the coast. Speaking of the coast, I'm doing a little riff here on the coastal ecology that's dependent on upstream watersheds and wetlands. And I'll just mention Lake Okeechobee. We had some late season storms in the fall that created a higher lake. The lake is almost 2 feet higher this year than it was last year. Because of that, the Army Corps of Engineers has been letting lots and lots of water out, both east and west, to the St. Lucie River estuary and also to the Caloosahatchee River estuary, which is bad news because it causes impacts to those estuarine systems, the oysters and seagrasses and all the plants and animals that depend on water quality, in particular salinities. The salinity balance is off, the nutrients go up because it's coming from this lake. But the Army Corps has to do that because we've changed the way the Everglades work and the way Lake Okeechobee works. So they're trying to get it down before the rains start in June. If Mother Nature cooperates, we may be able to get it down to a manageable level below 13 feet, perhaps by June. We're hopeful, but we don't know that. And unfortunately, this high lake and all these dumps mean that we're likely to have red tide this as a consequence of all these dumps in the latter part of the year, next fall or later in the summer. So that would be a bad thing, but it's what we're faced with. And one other coastal consequence I wanted to flag for you is down on Marco Island, there's a lagoon called Tigertail Lagoon at Tigertail Beach. Last summer, we lost 75 black skimmer fledglings to a mysterious illness in which their joints were all swelling up. They were healthy otherwise. And so we sent several of these samples off to be necropsied, which is a wildlife, basically an autopsy of a wild animal after it's died to figure out what killed it. And here it turns out they had several kinds of bacteria, including several fecal bacteria. This is not a good thing. And the question arises, where did those bacteria come from? The investigation of that source was not pursued by the agencies because of funding, lack of funding, and a lack of planning and programs to identify these sources. And I want to flag this as an issue we need to figure out. We need to tackle and encourage our agencies like DEP and the Florida Department of Health to pursue these kinds of die-offs of wildlife. We also have manatees dying now. There's a current red tide, as I said, it's affecting other wildlife species. Royal terns on Sanibel were dying by the dozens and being taken in, and they were being run over as they were disoriented on the Sanibel Causeway this winter. And this is a terrible thing. And I've seen gulls and royal terns myself on Fort Myers Beach that were disoriented and falling over from what's called brevetoxicosis, which is the red tide poisoning they have. So we've got to get a handle on that. Obviously, it's water quality sourced, but we need to expect that when we have water quality problems, let's pursue that with proper funding of testing. Okay, and one other thing I just wanted to flag is that some people have said, well, isn't the development out east in eastern Collier County a cause for water concerns? And I will tell you that there are lots of reasons to pay attention to those developments, but water issues, water supply is not one of them. Frankly, when you convert farm fields like the ones you see on the left here to urban development, and this is the conceptual plan for the new town that's being proposed by Collier Enterprises. It's got hearings coming up this week and in subsequent weeks. You reduce your water uses in converting ag to urban by at least 40%. So that's a savings. Agriculture actually is one of the biggest consumers of water in the state of Florida. It's also one of the biggest nutrient sources because of fertilizer and the way they manage their water in the state of Florida. So that's definitely something to be watching. So back to the model. Where is this water going that is being taken away from Corkscrew Swamp? Our hypotheses were agriculture, as I just noted, or water supply for people, public water supply, residential uses, or increased evapotranspiration, as you see in this upper right, for a new kind of invasion of willow. It's a very invasive plant, even though it's native, or because of water management, flood control systems. Those were our hypotheses. So we engaged with the help of the Water Management District and the Big Cypress Basin. We engaged some expert modelers with Water Science Associates in Fort Myers to do a model to test the hypotheses that we had. This is the model domain. This is Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary right in the middle. The first scenario that we tested was that question of agricultural use pumping and water supply pumping. So we tested in different combinations. All this peach colored polygons in this map are agriculture all around Corkscrew. You can see a lot of ag, mostly citrus, but also some row crops for vegetables north of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary right in the middle here. The white dots are public water supply wells in Lee County and in Collier County. So we tested how much influence that had on the water levels in Corkscrew. When we removed pumping for both ag and water supply, it did bring back some water, but very modestly, about half a foot and a few weeks of inundation. So that wasn't getting us back to the way it was back in the 60s and 70s. So then we tested in the next scenario, removing all the willow under the theory that the willow was increasing evapotranspiration. They had much deeper roots than the grasses that normally, the sawgrass that would have been in those marshes as these willow invade. And you can see the extent of willow invasion in the Corkscrew system, both in Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, the Crew Marsh, and down Camp Keys Strand and around Lake Trafford. It's a lot. But in having modeled it, we did not see a big response. In fact, we didn't see any response at the boardwalk to adding any water to that level. So while it was a huge improvement in habitat quality, it did not help the hydrology. The final scenario we looked at was removing the canals south of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Basically, we were in model land, in virtual world, we were able to take out all the flood control systems, the canals that have been built over many decades to protect residences and businesses and roads, and see what effect that had on the hydrology of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. And lo and behold, that was a huge response. This is a hydrograph of, in red, what the water levels are from year to year, from 2013 to 2018. And you can see in red the way it is today. It dries down below ground level, which is 0, the line in the middle, almost every year except for this one year in 2016 where we had a lot of rain. When we took out all the canals through the model, that's what the blue line shows. It went back to the way it was in the 1960s and the 1970s. So lo and behold, that was the primary driver for these drawdowns in Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, according to the model. So then the question arises, well, what do we do about it? Well, so what you see in this map is a engineering solution to trying to hold water, because in model land, while we can take away all those canals, in the real world, we can't, because people live in these places. We can't flood people out. There's too many people that have moved here. So kind of like the Everglades, we only have part of the system left. And so in order to reproduce the functions that nature used to provide for free with wetlands, we have to figure out how to engineer some of this. So we tested what's called a clay retainer wall below ground in this pink line at the top of what's called Bird Rookery Swamp, south of Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Here's Corkscrew Swamp up above on the north, and this is Bird Rookery Swamp to the south. And then we also put in some more weirs to hold back water on ditches and canals to the south of Corkscrew to see if we could hold more water and back it up into Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Now, the result of that was, as we looked at it, we saw a response that was very encouraging. It did not get us back to what we saw by taking all the canals out, but it did show us we can move the needle. We can hold water back. So we have some data gaps. And so what we need to do is reconfigure these projects, get some more data, and then remodel this with reconfigured strategies to see if we can't hold even more water back without flooding people out. So the conclusions are that we found our drivers. The two drivers were pumping for ag and for water supply, which was a very modest influence, and then the canal system for flood control, which was a huge influence. We saw that the willow has a big influence on habitat quality, but it did not do a lot for returning the hydrology. So let's talk about strategies in response to that. What are we going to do about this now that we know what the primary drivers of overdraining Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, which, by the way, we strongly believe that extends regionally into the Golden Gate Estates, the Corkscrew Island community, and elsewhere. This is a problem not unique to Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary. Let's look at some solutions. Here's a map of Bonita Springs, and you can see in blue areas that flood every 5 years. It's called the 5-year floodplain. We need to figure out ways to hold more water, to keep houses in those areas that hold more water after big storm events that flood every time. We need to move those houses out, basically buy those houses out and shift those folks to higher ground. Because it's like New Orleans after Katrina. There are certain areas that are just indefensible. And we also need to redo stormwater systems that are not holding enough water upstream. So our stormwater systems are not adequate for protecting nature, and certainly not adequate for protecting people. So that needs to be reconfigured. And there are actually projects out there that have been designed. That in 2011, the Collier County had developed a whole strategy called its Stormwater Management Plan, and they have not implemented all those projects. In fact, they've hardly implemented any of them. So we need to dust off that book and bring it out and start working on those projects. Likewise, the Water Management District and Army Corps have a set of projects called the Southwest Florida Comprehensive Watershed Management Plan. Those projects largely have not been implemented since 2013. So opportunities. We should be buying land like the Corkscrew Regional Ecosystem Watershed Project. This area north of Corkscrew is called the Crew Headwaters. It's got a lot of citrus. We should be buying that and turning it into wetland restoration projects. And we should be collaborating with other hydrologic modeling efforts. There's one going on in South Lee County right now. And there's also Lee County is doing a flood mitigation project, which if it's not done right or coordinated well, it could turn out to be more drainage than it is protection. So we need to collaborate with them so that turns out to be a better outcome for nature and for people. And we need to change the rules. We need to look at rule changes to stop the development in floodplains. Let's not permit any of that kind of development anymore. And we need to prohibit discharges, the kind that have been dumping up from citrus farms onto citrus groves onto Corkscrew Swamp and other places. Let's prohibit that through legislation and rule changes. And as I pointed out, we have been losing wetlands. We've lost over 30,000 acres of wetlands since 1996 in Lee and Collier County alone. 30,000 acres, even though we have wetland rules that say that we have no net loss of wetlands, or that's the goal. But clearly 30,000 acres belie that goal. It's not working. So we need to fix those rules. And we need to move our public water supply away from superficial sources. On the map to the right, you see public water supply wells in Southwest Florida that are in the Lower West Coast Water Supply Plan, the last update. All the blue are superficial sources, which they're drawing from canals and lakes and superficial aquifers. Well, that directly competes with our wetlands and our places like Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary and Bird Rookery Swamp. let's move to deeper sources like the Floridan aquifer. Yes, it's more expensive, but that's the way to solve that conflict. And we need to retrofit those stormwater systems that would dump water through partnerships and investment of public money. So the next steps clearly are, let's get the data, let's figure out what we need to design in terms of mitigation projects. We also need to collaborate with all the agencies, Collier County, Lee County, Bonita Springs. This is a picture of flooding after Hurricane Irma in East Bonita Springs. These are some of those houses that are in that floodplain. So clearly, nobody wants to have that kind of a situation that frequently. And we need funding. We need to be advocating for funding for these kinds of solutions. It's expensive to buy out these houses and move them to safer ground. And we also need to invest in and support those new policies and rule fixes so that we're not destroying wetlands, we're not dumping on our neighbor, we're basically having hydrologic golden rule attainment. We don't want anybody dumping water on us, and we shouldn't be dumping on them. And speaking of legislative fixes, I just want to flag a couple of bills that are in the legislature this year. There's a proposed bill 7062 on something called the Central Florida Water Initiative. It's basically a way to resolve conflicts between 3 different water management districts and the Central Florida area, that place that has Disney World and millions of other people flocking to it. Water is a huge problem there. So this is a good bill to try and resolve some of those conflicts. Senate Bill 64 is a bill that would incentivize reuse and require a 5-year plan to stop dumping polluted water in our waterways. And Senate Bill 1552 would require implementation of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force that started 2 years ago at the direction of Governor DeSantis. We need to implement what they have recommended, strategies for monitoring septic and making sure people maintain their septic systems, or converting septic to central sewer systems so that you don't have pollution entering our waterways that way. As well as other strategies, better BMPs for agriculture, best management practices to reduce pollution. As I said, agriculture is one of the biggest sources for nutrient pollution of phosphorus and nitrogen. So those are some legislative opportunities. Is it enough? No, but these are steps in the right direction. We need to encourage those of our legislators. I want to thank our teams that worked on the modeling project for Corkscrew Swamp Sanctuary, the Water Science Associates, Roger Kopp and Kirk Martin, and Marcello Lago of Lago Consulting, and then the South Florida Water Management District and Big Cypress Basin, as led by Charlotte Roman, who's their chair, have given staff and financial support. And it's obviously something that we have to collaborate on, as was done on this model. Let's take the next steps and try and fix these problems, not only for Corkscrew, but for our whole region here. So with that, I encourage you to type in some questions in the Q&A. And I think Amy was going to share those, and we can have a little discussion about that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brad. That was really, really interesting. We do have a couple of questions that have come in. One question is loss of habitat. How can we stop all the unmitigated urban sprawl that is destroying all the wetlands and releasing all the nutrients into the water?
So that's the never-ending question that we as humans have to figure out. We all want to live in places that are beautiful, have clean water and wildlife, but we have to figure out how to put our developments, our communities, in places that are sustainable, have the least amount of conflict with panther habitat and wetlands and wood storks, and are are able to be compatible with those ecosystems. And so we can do it through legislation, we can do it through land use planning, we can do it through investment in these kinds of outcomes. But unless our legislators and our representatives hear us that we want that, sometimes the lowest common denominator is the result. So.
Yeah, that's a very good point. That's sometimes the hardest hurdle to get over. So we have another question regarding the Tigertail Lagoon issue. When you say
Yes.
fecal bacteria, is that human fecal bacteria that's infecting the birds?
So that is kind of the $10,000 question that has not been answered because, as I understand it from the agency staff, in order to determine whether that's animal sourced or human sourced, it costs about $1,000 a test to figure that out, and there was no budget to do that testing. It's called genetic source testing, and the agencies were not prepared to do that genetic source testing. We need to encourage the Florida Department of Health and DEP in particular to plan for these kinds of testing, because as we have seen since 2018, in the red tide die-offs, it's a phenomenon that recurs unfortunately regularly, and we need to know what the cause of these die-offs are, because those are canaries in our coal mine, and if we don't figure that out, there are human consequences to that problem. So that's the reason we can't answer the question.
Okay. The next question is, how will climate change affect coastal flooding and affect the prioritization of mitigation activities?
So climate change is going to be already is a huge influence. So if you're talking about the coast, like all the beaches where these short black skimmers that died, they're a threatened species, but not only are they threatened by bacteria, but they're also threatened by erosion and coastal storms. And as sea level rise goes up, we're going to lose that beach habitat for them and for sea turtles. And so, so we have to figure out how we can maintain and keep those kinds of coastal habitats. And frankly, it's going to involve some retreat from the coast. Otherwise, we will not be able to keep beaches in Florida, which would be ironic and sad. And then the other part of the equation is precipitation. So climate change involves greater precipitation from storms like tropical storms, but also more intense droughts. So when you have, like this year, we have a La Nina winter. A La Nina winter is a dry winter typically. Now, this particular winter, we need it to be dry, as I talked about Lake Okeechobee being too high. But that can be a problem for wildfire and water supply and even wetlands. So we have some serious consequences and adaptation and planning that we're going to have to address. That compact that I mentioned is going to be one regional way that we can collaborate both with staff and with data and analyses and strategies and funding even to adapt and mitigate some of these problems.
So the next question is, how do people living in the floodplain in Bonita get mortgages? I live on the 4th floor of a building on relatively high ground, and every year the mortgage company demands that I prove the building has flood insurance.
That's a great question. And some folks may remember about 10 years ago, there was a bill in Congress in Washington, D.C. that was a fiscal responsibility bill that basically said, the answer to the question is that we in the public are subsidizing those mortgages with flood insurance that is artificially cheap. Because a bank will require you, if you take a mortgage out, to have flood insurance if you live in a flood zone. That's just the fact. But that flood insurance is artificially cheap because we, and as US taxpayers, are subsidizing the risk for coastal development in flood zones. And that's, so there was a bill called the Bigger Waters Act about a decade ago that was passed by Congress that was going to demand that people over a period of years, just a few years, basically pay the actual cost for the risk, which was going to, in our case, it would have made our flood insurance go up by 10 times. And as you might guess, the real estate industry just sent up a hue and a cry and said, you can't do that to us. Well, so they retracted the bill and they didn't enforce it. And so today we still have subsidized flood insurance, but there's going to come a reckoning on that as risk with sea level rise and storms continues to rise. We can't afford to subsidize that kind of risky, hazardous location for development. So I think the day is coming soon that we won't see that anymore. And there will be money instead, and it will be wise money spent as much as it will be to buy those places out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That would be a big undertaking for sure. We have a question from Carol, and she says, great talk, Brad. Can you remind us of the percentage of Florida homes that are on septic tanks and how often the septic tanks are required to be inspected?
Yeah, I don't know the percentage, so I wish I did. People who are from Marco will remember some years ago, you were required to convert from septic. If you can think of Marco Island all being on septic, it was when I moved here in 1992. That's not a good recipe for a barrier island to all be on septic tanks. The same was true in the Florida Keys, and DEP required the Florida Keys to convert to central sewer, and the same was true on Marco Island. That cost about $20,000 a house to convert at the time. I think that was maybe 15 years ago. I can't remember exactly, but that was not cheap. All of Golden Gate Estates, almost all of Golden Gate Estates is on septic. And the inspections are very lax. There was a bill that Audubon supported a few years ago that was passed that required regular inspections, I think every 5 years, and maintenance. But that was deemed to be onerous and expensive. And so the legislature the next year rescinded it. It's like, God, you guys finally do something right. And then, and then you take it back. So that was unfortunate, but that is something that we need. And one of the recommendations from the Blue-Green Algae Task Force was indeed to have inspections so that we know our septic systems are good. For instance, the Isles of Capri is all on septic systems, and that's not very far from Tigertail Lagoon. So they really should be looking at the integrity of those septic systems.
Yeah, that's a great point. Siam says, excellent presentation, thank you. How do the leaders and politicians listen? Are they listening, and are they responding?
I would say they're always listening, because as politicians, they want to know which way the wind is blowing, figuratively, of course, sometimes literally. But, and so I would point to Governor DeSantis's directions when he got into office in 2019. He saw that there was a need for water quality and some response to the harmful algal blooms, both red tide and blue-green algae and cyanobacteria. So he set up those 2 task forces, which are still in place and still making recommendations. I think it's a fair statement to say, have they really been implementing all the things that they said they were going to do? And I don't think so. I think they've done some of the things. And so it's really on us to remind our legislators, both in Tallahassee and locally, that there's more to be done. That if you see red tide today, which we do in Pine Island Sound, then that's not a good thing. And if we see dead wildlife, that's not a good thing. We don't want manatees washing up dead from brevetoxicosis. We need to do more. And so listening has to be listening all the way.
Yeah, Brad, that's a really interesting point, because I think so many of us saw some relief in sight when he formed the Blue-Green Algae Task Force, but then the legislation never really kicked in. Why is that? Was there not
Well,
enough public pressure, or what happened there?
I think people's memories are short. There was Senate Bill 712, which was passed and was a partial response to Blue-Green Algae Task Force recommendations. So some of them were seen they came to the light of day. Some things did get implemented, but the criticism of that bill that many people had was that it didn't go far enough. Audubon saw it as some first steps and agreed it didn't go far enough. Let's do the next round of legislation. We see some legislation this year that goes a little bit further. We have not addressed the problem of biosolids. So even if you've gotten off of septic and on-site sewer plants, what do you do with all the solid waste that comes out of the central sewer systems? So if you look at Miami, they ship it all up to Indian River County. Well, and what happens to it there? It gets applied to farms and called fertilizer. But we know what the fate of that is. It rains and that goes into the water stream, and you end up with algae in our springs and in our waterways and on our estuaries. And so clearly, scientists know what these problems are, and so they're trying to tell us with good information what we should be addressing, and we're not getting a full response yet, partly because it's expensive, probably mainly because it's expensive.
We have a question from Jeannie, two questions actually. Can we tap into the public's enthusiasm for fishing and availability of local fresh fish? Any help from the fishing industry with tourism associations? And the second part to her question is, under the new administration, is there any possibility of funding from the EPA?
Absolutely. I think Michael Regan, the new EPA administrator, is very young, first Black administrator. He's from North Carolina, really sharp guy that should be able to make a difference on some important things. Like, for instance, Florida just assumed the 404 program from the Clean Water Act, the federal wetland permitting program from the Army Corps. A lot of us, including Audubon, are not happy about that because the state and the Army Corps don't have good track records, and it seems like a recipe for failure to put both of those permitting programs in one agency that wasn't doing a good job with just one program. Now they've got two, no more staff and no more budget. So I'm hopeful that Regan and EPA will look at the possibility of rescinding that assumption and looking at better ways to protect wetlands. And to answer your question about fishermen and tourism, absolutely. So if you've heard of the group called Captains for Clean Water, or the Calusa Waterkeeper with John Cassani, these are great advocates who are allies of Audubon and all of ours that we need to be supporting on the Caloosahatchee River, Estero Bay, and Pine Island Sound. So tourism, also look at the hotels and the restaurateurs. The tourism industry has a lot to lose, and did lose a lot in 2018 when there was red tide for over a year. So yes, they are huge allies, and their voice counts for a lot.
Yeah, both of those groups have been so active. I was admiring what the Calusa Waterkeepers were able to do when they exposed the tons and tons of raw sewage being dumped into the Caloosahatchee by the city of Fort Myers. And I think the city faced a $500,000 fine, which is really nothing compared to what they did. So it'll be interesting to see all the information that comes out when all of that is exposed.
Yeah, I think it goes to integrity in monitoring, integrity in wastewater processing. One of the bills I mentioned addresses wastewater and reducing the pollution and nutrients in wastewater. It's a reuse incentive bill. So, fines are I guess that says the right thing, but action is really what we need. We need these agencies to hold accountable our wastewater utilities, et cetera, around the state.
Sure. Next question. Is there anyone in the state or federal government looking at what happens, what mitigating steps can be taken over the next 100 years or so as sea level rise means lots of buildings in Southwest Florida otherwise will be underwater?
Well, that's a really hard problem. And the Army Corps of Engineers answer to that was to build big walls and gates and close off the passes when a storm is coming. And, you know, that's not going to last very long, and it's going to destroy a lot of habitat. That was our objection when we commented on that plan in Collier County. You know, I appreciate that the Army Corps is being serious. They were going to spend over $2 billion on building gates and walls and flood protection for basically armoring our coast. But armoring cannot really save our cookies. We've got to do something much more systemic. We've got to look at migration of our coastal communities in the most low-lying areas. Think of Everglades City here in Collier County. Everglades City has a bullseye on it, unfortunately. It suffers in every storm. That's a place, unfortunately, like New Orleans, that has some very, very low-lying vulnerable places. And so we start this by doing a vulnerability assessment. There's an actual engineering strategy where you apply modeling and data and figure out where are we vulnerable, what can we do, what response do we have. This is all apart from mitigation. I mean, we should also be mitigating and reducing our carbon footprint and going to, you know, planting trees. Reforestation is one of the best ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere. You know, that's, so if you're talking 100 years, you know, we need to be doing all of the above. But I think migration is going to be a very prominent strategy in human communities all around the world as we look to where we have to resettle ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. I know in the city, I believe the new structures that are going up, maybe the beach club and some of the other high rises, they're, you know, planning on the entry areas being up on the second floor so that future roads can actually go above what might be, you know, high water in the years coming forward. So that'll be interesting. And I wish we could do more about it now. Yeah, it's quite the dilemma. Larry has a question. He says, since most residents want the same thing, clean air, water, and access to nature, as well as viability in light of rising temperatures and water levels, are there new collaborations forming that will help improve our environment?
New collaborations. So I guess I will point to Everglades restoration and all the different dozens and dozens of projects like the Picayune Strand Restoration Project here, which is turning the old South Golden Gate Estates into 70,000 acres of wetlands and panther habitat. There's a strategic partnership amongst the agencies, the Water Management District, the Army Corps, conservation groups like Audubon and Conservancy and Florida Wildlife Federation, as well as farmers like Lippman Farms, and the parks, Collier Seminole State Park down there. We're all in Rookery Bay. We're all trying to collaborate. And we've spent the last year looking at ways to reduce nutrient pollution into the 10,000 Islands and Rookery Bay and Collier Seminole. And so I think that's a model for getting the stakeholders, people who have an interest, as Larry points out. Everybody wants clean water. Everybody wants, you know, wildlife to survive. We don't want to contribute to the decline of more birds in the United States, like we have just learned about. So stakeholders can figure out how they can contribute to collective work to solve these problems. And the Everglades restoration, I think, is a good example of lots of different interests getting around the table and saying, all right, you know, let's do this. We can't afford to fail on this.
Sure, absolutely. Brad, I wanted to thank you for all your time today and your insights on some of these environmental challenges that we're facing. I feel that your ability to shine the light on these issues helps all of us to understand what we need to do. And basically, we need to get out there, spread the word, help educate the public, get the voters out, and try to make some changes. So thank you very much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure.